breaking news of President Trump threatening to slap China with additional tariffs.
Let's talk about China now. Donald Trump is doubling down on Beijing. In 2 days, he has raised tariffs on China twice. Anything coming from China into the U.S. will be taxed 125%. The U.S. president has singled out China.
The trade wars are getting intense, and China's president is leading the charge. Just days after the U.S. president raised tariffs on Chinese products by over 50%, China struck back with a much greater hit that shook the U.S. economy.
We begin with breaking news from the United States, where Donald Trump has announced a raft of tariffs.
With a possible global recession on the horizon, people are wondering how things got this bad so fast.
I think for that kind of speaking out and you're basically saying what is happening here.
How did a simple trade rivalry between two prosperous countries grow into something so disturbing? And how did the U.S. president respond to China's bold move? Stay till the end as we fully unpack the trade wars, China's big move, and America's response.
We're putting a 50% tariff on above the tariffs that we put on.
China's decisive hit. On April 4th, the Chinese government made an announcement that turned the global trade market on its head. Leading market analysts predicted the worst when the Chinese leaders announced that the Republic would be imposing an 84% tariff on all American products from April 10th. The ripple effects are so shocking that those experts believe this price hike would lead to a global recession if it isn't dealt with properly. And the reason behind this is even more surprising. Trusted sources tell us that this decision by China's leaders was a direct response to the U.S. president's decrees to increase tariff fees on Chinese imports by up to 50%.
We're now on the president's threat against China to impose an extra 50% tariff on goods imported into the U.S.
Just a few days earlier, and it wasn't the first time. After China made its shocking move, all eyes were on the U.S. president to know the next thing he was going to do. The clock was ticking fast as leaders from other countries arrived in Washington to negotiate a good deal with the president. What happened later that day was unheard of. That afternoon, the U.S. president got a phone call from South Korea's president and confirmed he would have a long conversation with their representatives on how to make the new tariffs more affordable and beneficial for both countries. Other nations affected by the new tariff policies were phoning in as well, but China was the exception. Unlike the others, China's leaders weren't willing to have trade talks. Their strategy was much simpler. Once the U.S. increases the tariff on our goods, we increase ours on their products as well. While the world waited for the U.S. president to make his statement, he rather made a surprising quote on social media. China wants to make a deal badly, but doesn't know how to get it started. We are waiting for their call. It will happen. All it took was a few hours after that post for one of the U.S. president's aides to show doubts about the situation, and the next announcement was unbelievable. According to a U.S. trade representative during a Senate hearing, while other countries were trying to come up with ways of getting along, the Chinese president announced retaliation instead. Because of this, the U.S. president threatened to add another 59% increase to the tariff on China, bringing the total to over 104% on some Chinese products. What was the Chinese president's response? Very shocking, as we shall see. To everybody's surprise, the president openly called out the U.S. leaders in Washington as economic bullies. One of China's representatives on foreign trade spoke out about this earlier by saying, "We Chinese are not troublemakers, but we will not flinch when trouble comes our way. Intimidation, threats, and blackmail are not the right ways to engage with China. China will take measures to firmly safeguard its legitimate and lawful rights and interests. If the U.S. is determined to emerge in a trade war, China's response will continue to the end." As expected, the leaders in Washington got no call from China, and the U.S. president did as he said by putting the 104% tariff on Chinese imports. In response, China made their announcement and promised it would take effect from April 10th. If that was all they did, then perhaps it wouldn't cause as much fuss as it does now. So to top it all up, China also took steps to strengthen its control over rare earth elements that could only be found within its borders in large amounts. These minerals, including samarium and gadolinium, are used in building high-tech products like computer chips and batteries for EVs. And in that announcement, the Chinese leaders made it clear that they will also impose difficult export controls on these resources that are shipping off to the United States. Worse yet, they would only do so in very limited amounts. By doing this, they would gain control over materials needed by modern technologies, and gain the upper hand across various markets as a way of fighting back against these tariff policies. As many industry experts pointed out, the consequences of this action have many far-reaching effects. Because of this, there was immense pressure from private industries within both countries that lobbied their governments to change their minds about going off on a trade war. Many business operations would crash, and the prices of goods would almost double. For most of these companies, the ones paying the price for these tariffs are the loyal customers. A great example of this recently happened with the popular Japanese video game company, Nintendo. Not long ago, they announced the launch date and price of their long-awaited next-generation handheld console, the Nintendo Switch 2. Many loyal users were excited about the product, and the full package was planned to launch on June 5th at a steep $450 for the base model and $500 for the special edition, with games included. The price was a bit high, as it was at least $150 more than the original Nintendo Switch that came out in 2017. Still though, most users were willing to pay for it and couldn't wait to pre-order the console online. But not long after the US president revealed the law on the new tariffs on other countries, Nintendo announced they would be revising the price of the console based on how tariff negotiations end between Japan's representatives and the US leaders in Washington. For most users, this means the price of the console, which is already too high for most users, will likely increase before launch day because of the higher tariff. But it doesn't stop there. Some reports even claim that the World Trade Organization is getting involved as well, by setting the stage for difficult, open discussions between both countries. After facing a lot of pressure from domestic and foreign companies affected by these tariffs, the White House put out a statement to address the other reasons why they had to increase tariffs for China and other nations. But the unexpected happened when the US president on April 9th made a big change by announcing that his new tariff plan would be paused for 90 days. This sudden pause covered over 75 countries, implying that for the next 3 months, the US will not raise tariffs as the leaders claimed they would. Rather, the US would reduce the rate to a 10% baseline for countries that chose to negotiate instead of retaliating like China. At this point, it was clear that the US leaders were using China as an example of what happens when a country chooses to retaliate instead of trying to come to an agreement. And the United States took things one step further by increasing the tariffs from 104 to 125%. This was leaps and bounds above what was once less than 2 months before. Some felt this move was out of line, even when dealing with a country that was allegedly not playing fairly in trade and hurting the US economy, and just as expected, the outcome from this decision alone was insane. The stock market index, known to most as a sign of the country's economic health, surprisingly increased by almost 10%, proving to most that the tariff pause was a good thing for the US economy. But while it got market analysts worried for a while, the truth is this isn't America's first game of chess with China. The trade wars. It all started way back in August 2017, an interesting time when tariff prices were less than 4% and gas prices didn't cost an arm and a leg. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for a while as far as trade was concerned, but the US president felt something was not right with China's trade habits.
Donald Trump says he is open to talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping after imposing an even higher tariff.
Behind the scenes, there were multiple accusations about Chinese firms putting pressure on US companies to transfer their best technologies to Chinese entities. The US government wasn't comfortable with it, as the leaders felt it was affecting the rights of these smaller companies to maintain ownership of their intellectual property. Chinese leaders spoke out against this back then, stating that the United States was going beyond the rules set by the World Trade Organization over baseless accusations, and it only got worse from there. When the new year came, the United States took decisive steps that set the foundation for the insane tariffs we are seeing today from both countries. That year, the Trump administration imposed tariffs ranging from 20 to 50% on imported solar panels and washing machines. This was done specifically because Chinese producers, profiting off US technologies, were having an unfair advantage over American manufacturing companies that built these appliances. The worth of appliances that were affected by this tariff rose to over $1 billion, and the problem got more intense on March 1st of that year when the US president put more tariffs on other imported resources like steel and aluminum from multiple countries, including China, for the same reasons. Though it only affected about 3% of America's tell, the Wall Street Journal's top industry made a shocking prediction. They predicted even though the country's economic index might be showing good numbers, causing problems like this with other countries was a misstep that would soon begin to backfire. As they predicted, China fought back on April 2nd of that year by imposing a 25% tariff on 128 American products like fruits, nuts, and wine. Their response was swift and effective, affecting over $2 billion in U.S. exports. The following day, the U.S. president released a list of Chinese goods that would get higher tariffs as well, as the total amount of affected imports reached over $50 billion. Yet again, barely a day after, China announced the loss of U.S. products that would be affected by tariff increases, including soybeans and automobiles. Now, it wasn't just growing tensions between two rivals. It was now a full-blown trade war. With many citizens from both sides calling for negotiation, both countries agreed in May 2018 to stop increasing tariffs and always choose to discuss things first before increasing prices. Now, there was hope that both countries would get along. All it took was a month for things to break down between both countries, as on June 15th, back then, the United States confirmed another tariff increase that would affect another $50 billion worth of Chinese imports. When this happened, the Chinese government accused the United States of starting a trade war at a time when both countries were willing to make things right. China's Ministry of Commerce vowed to retaliate by doing the same thing barely 2 weeks later on $34 billion of imported goods. As usual, the U.S. took things a step further on July 10th by doing the same thing with $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. China retaliated on August 3rd with $60 billion. With both sides under pressure, they decided to call another truce about 3 weeks later. Interestingly, though, the following morning, both countries announced plans to make things worse, with the U.S. putting 10% more tariff and an increase to 25% by the end of the year.
British-made products will face tariffs of 10% from this Saturday.
The U.S. president threatened to increase the tariff if China retaliated without trying to come to another agreement as they initially promised. But just as the Western leaders predicted, China retaliated yet again in September 2018 with a smaller tariff hike. It seemed every effort to make things right only got thwarted the following morning by a new problem between both countries. This was most obvious in December 2018 during the G20 summit, which was a meeting of different world leaders from different economies. During that event, the Chinese and American presidents agreed not to increase tariffs for 90 days. For the next 3 months, representatives from both countries will have enough time to discuss and come to an agreement on the tariff that would benefit both countries in the long run, not something that would barely last for a day. But even though there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon, many chose not to trust this agreement, and sadly enough, they were right. As later that evening, the chief financial officer of Huawei was arrested in Canada for breaking U.S. laws and sanctions against Iran. But unexpectedly, it did not affect what both presidents agreed. And the few months of negotiations between both countries continued until April 2019, when China backtracked on one of the promises made during their negotiations with the United States, leading to yet another tariff increase. Huawei, China's pride and joy in mobile technology, had a role to play in this, and the scandals that unfolded were almost frightening. Huawei's controversies. The smartphone was affected during this time when the United States banned American economies from supplying components to Huawei, a Chinese smartphone manufacturer without approval from the government. The problem started when American leaders were worried about how close this smartphone company was to the Chinese government, especially with how good they were with 5G technologies and data collection. They believed that Huawei could use their highly advanced tools, not found in any other company in the world, to collect information from other countries that use their products. It also didn't help that Huawei allegedly broke multiple U.S. laws by doing business with sanctioned countries and stealing ideas from American countries. There was a lot of proof for this, and a great example was when the United States made strong sanctions against Iran. This sanction came about because the U.S. government was concerned about the country's likeness for building dangerous weapons, and it meant by effect that American companies were not allowed to sell things to Iran or even work with businesses from that place. This law also stopped foreign companies working with American products from working with Iran as well. But by December 2018, the United States found out that Huawei had been doing business with Iran for many years and was using secret deals and bribes to get away with it. One of the companies used by Huawei to pull this off was an equipment manufacturing company called Skycom. This was supposed to be a different company, but was later revealed to be part of Huawei. Leaked documents showed that Huawei allegedly used another company to do this secretly. This other company used by Huawei was called Skycom. This company did not have any trade with the United States and never used resources from America to make their products. According to law, this meant Skycom was not limited by U.S. sanctions from interacting with Iran to sell their products. When U.S. leaders called out the company for doing this, Huawei's top financial officer was allegedly caught lying to banks about it and was later arrested before the new year. The official was brought to trial for fraud and breaking U.S. law. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were also many times when Huawei was allegedly caught stealing ideas from American companies. The first happened way back in 2003 when Cisco, a U.S. tech company, sued Huawei for copying huge chunks of their networking software without giving them credit. Huawei's representatives tried to deny this at first, but it was proven in court not long after that Cisco's accusations were right all along. The codes revealed by Huawei as their own had the same code errors and glitches that were present in the original files made by Cisco. With the cat out of the bag, Huawei agreed to change its products, and that was how the case was settled. But this wasn't the last time Huawei was caught stealing ideas from American companies. The next big moment came in 2007 when Motorola sued Huawei for stealing wireless communications and trade secrets for unreleased products through their former employees. As usual, the Chinese company denied the claims, but the case dragged on for 4 years until both companies came to an agreement. Nobody knows what the agreement was or how it was handled in court, but it was a huge red flag. All it took was 3 years for the next scandal to hit, and it happened in 2014 when Huawei was accused yet again of stealing technology from a testing robot made by the American tech company T-Mobile. This robot was made by the company to test how well smartphones responded to finger taps on their newest touchscreen hardware. T-Mobile accused Huawei's employees of taking photos of the secret robot before it was meant to be revealed and measuring parts of it without permission. By 2017, a U.S. jury found Huawei guilty of the crimes they were accused of and were charged $4.8 million to settle the case. It was cases like these that caused the United States to stop Western companies from selling software to Huawei without special permission. Google was an American company, and this stopped them from giving native Android software and updates to Huawei. Qualcomm, one of the best companies in the world producing some of the fastest chips and mobile processors for all kinds of smartphones, was also an American company, and they too were banned from providing the hardware needed for Huawei to build faster and more reliable phones. Thanks to the world knowing about their scandals, other countries started to think twice about using Huawei's 5G technology as well. Many U.S. allies like the UK and Australia began to think of boycotting Huawei to protect their native companies from getting abused by the Chinese company, causing the company to suffer on a deep level. Huawei tried to recover from this by making their own chips and software, but neither of these did very well on a global level. Huawei's software, Harmony OS, doesn't have the needed support from developers to compete against bigger giants like Android and Apple. Their chipset, while fast and reliable for everyday activities, still performs way less than the more advanced chipset made by Qualcomm through their famous Snapdragon processors. Other issues like overheating and performance lag have plagued their systems for years now. So much so that Huawei's officials had to directly encourage users on their online community page not to lose hope over the hardware's future. All this happened because the US didn't want anything to do with Huawei anymore, and the Chinese leaders took this to heart for multiple reasons. Huawei was China's pride and joy when it came to mobile technologies, and it's through this company that 5G became common in the country and many other places in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Hurt by the strict sanctions imposed by the US government, China announced plans to create a list of American companies to cancel, and the next thing they did was even more unbelievable. Manipulating the market. China's next plan was strange but brilliant. Instead of striving for ways to improve their economy and the value of their currency during such difficult times, they did their best to make sure the value of the yuan went lower than the dollar. Why did they do this, you ask? Why would they hurt their economy on purpose? Well, to put it simply, when $1 can buy more Chinese money, Chinese products can easily be bought by Americans at a cheaper price in a way that works to China's benefit. This way, they can adapt to market conditions whenever the United States increases tariffs by simply lowering the value of their currency so their products can remain cheap and always in demand. It was like a secret weapon that made Chinese products very competitive with native American products, even though they come with high tariffs. Angry about this, the officials at the U.S. Treasury under the Trump administration called out China as a currency manipulator. China took another shot at the United States through other means as well, and one of them was in agriculture. China was once one of the biggest importers of American soybeans and other farm products that contributed to the U.S.'s economy. And to get back at them, the Chinese government cut down over 90% of purchases across the republic. To manage the financial loss on farmers across the country, the U.S. president had to send a bailout package that cost at least $16 billion in late 2019. Though it was something the United States could afford, it was still a strong blow to the agricultural sector. And as the year came to a close, both countries kept fighting to get the upper hand until they decided to make another trade deal. Nobody knew how long this truce was going to last, but it was at least hopeful for both countries. In October 2019, they came to an agreement and signed the truce in January 2020. This truce was called the Phase 1 trade deal, and it contained agreements that said China should buy American goods for over 2 years. And in return, the United States would reduce a lot of the tariffs roasted in the previous year and cancel all plans to increase the prices. Everything seemed to be going perfectly well until the famous pandemic hit in early 2020. Many global supply chains were but indefinitely, and most countries were more focused on healthcare and quarantine than they were on importing and exporting items for trade. China and the United States weren't an exception, yet both sides tried their best to keep to their promises. But things began to change when both countries started throwing blame on where the pandemic came from. It also didn't help that China was struggling so much with keeping the promise, while the United States was still keeping their end of the agreement by keeping their tariffs low throughout the year. When the Biden administration took over in 2021, there seemed to be a greater hope that both countries would get along and bring an end to the trade war. President Biden made it clear that his administration will do what it takes to build a strong trade alliance with China. But the president also made it clear that the country will not shy away from confronting China on the issues that go against freedom and democracy. And all it took was about a year for those words to be tested. More trade scandals and controversies. Sometime in March 2021, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada imposed sanctions on Chinese officials for how they violated the rights of Muslims living in Xinjiang. This happened early in the Biden administration, and it set the tone for the rest of his term as the president. The trade war didn't come to an end as everyone hoped, and it only got worse when the U.S. Commerce Department added 7 Chinese tech companies to its list of national security concerns, and the details were quite frightening. Inside sources claim that these computers weren't just built for the Chinese government, but were also designed to be used for making more advanced weapons, tracking people through their apps, and helping their military. Using these methods, these companies paid by the Chinese government were allegedly helping the country's army get stronger in ways that could have been dangerous to America. To fight against this, the U.S. government decided that these companies were not allowed to buy American tech unless they got special permission. By June 2021, more stories came up about how various investments into Chinese stock had illegal ties to the country's surveillance industry, so President Biden increased the limits placed on these platforms owning Chinese stock to prevent U.S. money from supporting companies that pose a threat to the nation's security. The United States took things a step further by launching the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This was put up as a means of helping various smaller countries cooperate in a way that helped them thrive without relying too much on trade with China. August rolled around, and then came the famous Chips and Science Acto, cancel any chance China might have in building powerful computers with American technologies, and give the United States the upper hand in the trade war. 2023 was the year when something frightening was happening in the United States, as hundreds of people were getting sick and passing away from a dangerous drug called fentanyl.
You've been hearing about the deadly effects of fentanyl and how some people are getting their hands on it without even realizing.
Originally made to be a painkiller that was helpful in small amounts given by doctors, it quickly became a potential poison once it got into the wrong hands and used for fake medicines and street drugs. The substance grew so common that many people didn't know they were taking it, and those who supplied it learned how to make it from other chemicals. When police officers checked to see where the ingredients for this chemical came from, the officials found that many of them were shipped in large amounts from China. Worse yet, the companies supplying those ingredients allegedly knew the chemicals were used to make fentanyl and kept sending tons of them to the United States for huge sums of cash. The companies involved were sanctioned, and by late 2024, America's long list of canceled companies had risen to over 140. On top of that, a huge number of these companies were chip manufacturers like Nora Technology Group. By December of that year, the Bureau of Industry and Security gave new controls to limit China's production of semiconductor chips and other related technologies. For some, doing this was the right decision to keep China from growing its military strength. But for most, it was the final nail in the coffin for ending the trade war. By September last year, the tariff increases on electric cars rose to 100%, while those on solar cells reached 50%. This endless game of cat and mouse between the US and China continues to this day, and with China imposing 84% tariffs on US goods before getting slammed with 125%, it is clear that the trade wars aren't ending anytime soon, and the world continues to watch. With a few months pause on all tariffs, do you think the trade wars will come to an end anytime soon? If not, do you think it will ever end? Let us know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.